just going to rewind, very quickly. So as we go in Leviticus, we've started to realize that Leviticus, even though there are a lot of themes in Leviticus that are related to sacrifice and ritual, if it's put within the context of the big story, it starts to make a lot more sense. Why do I say that? And as I was looking in Leviticus, one thing that I was actually really struck by is the amount of research that comes up on this idea of the power of ritual. The power of ritual on our brain, the power of ritual on our body, the power of ritual on our embodied experience, how we feel things, and how the ritual that includes sound, includes smell, includes music, includes bodily action that we do from year to year, how that makes us and structures us. So when you start to look at Leviticus, yes, we are like almost thousands of years away from the time that it started. But the same fundamentals of how we look at rituals in our life, if we look at this from that perspective, Leviticus would start to make more sense. So as we talked about last time, the aim of the laws is fellowship and union with the living God. The law itself, even holiness is not an end of in itself. It's a means to the abundant life with God. When God says you become holy just like I'm holy, the reason why, because that's the only way to have fellowship with Him. Because there is no way to get close to Him unless you become holy. And the holiness at that time is not necessarily a title that I take. It's not like I become St. George. It's not a title, but it's the only means that I'm able to start have fellowship with God. Very, very briefly, we're going to go and discuss what we had last time in terms of the structure of the tabernacle, and then quickly start to then talk about the sacrifices. The tabernacle, as I kind of talked about, was this three-level, three-tier access to God, which was very much in parallel with Garden of Eden, because the Garden of Eden, the garden itself was on top of the mountain, and that was part of Eden. So the garden was the pinnacle of Eden. And then Eden, which is like where everything happened, okay? And then from there was the rest of the world. So when Adam and Eve were, expelled, they were expelled to death. That was Sheol, that was the water. So that three-level tier became how people would start to come to God. They'd come in from the outer court, and the outer court you had the altar of the burnt offering and the bronze laver, and then the holy place and the Holy of Holies. This will actually be showing us a little bit better here. And you can see over here, people come in. There is the altar of the burnt offering, where all the offerings that we are going to talk about today and next time are put on this bronze altar. But then as the priest is making it inside, to the holy, they have to wash themselves in the bronze laver. We talked about the bronze laver as the purification, as the water. We said actually the tradition says that it was made by the copper and the bronze with which the Egyptian women use as mirrors. So it's kind of that transformation when you're using something to glorify yourself, now to wash yourself and enter into God. And then as you go into the holy place had three things: the table of the showbread, and then the golden menorah, and then the altar of incense. We talked about how the table of the showbread, the 12 loaves, which were renewed every week, how that indicates the livelihood and the presence of the people of Israel. And the menorah was actually designed to overshadow, to light over the showbread. And God is saying that, the whole creation, the menorah, signified the whole creation, the lights, how God is continuously shining His presence upon us. And then the altar of incense, there was always incense, lighting up, because that was the fire and cloud. That was the symbol of God's presence. Always fire and cloud. You guys remember a lot that we talked about even last series. Fire and cloud is kind of the two-way of God's expression. Fire in revealing something, but cloud also hiding. There is a point of where God reveals Himself, but also He's the same God that hides Himself. So God in the same time is a fire and a cloud. So that was in the holy. But then you come into the Holy of Holies and you had the Ark of the Covenant. And we talked about in the Ark, it had several objects. It had the broken tablets, it had the renewed tablets, it had the manna, and it had the staff of Aaron, okay, which was basically the indication of God saying that this is the method of approaching God through the priesthood, through the selected priesthood, okay? And then on top of the Ark of the Covenant, there was the cherubim with 2 wings covering themselves, and we call this the mercy seat. And this is where God told them, I will speak to you from the mercy seat. So it became, when God, I find it just very beautiful, because when we think of God as the king speaking to us, sometimes our image goes to, like, you know what, he's on the throne of his glory. And that definitely is the case. That's a lot of the imagery in the second coming of Christ. But it's interesting when you look at the imagery and the names of how it was depicted in the Ark of the Covenant. God is speaking to them from the mercy seat, okay? Not just the throne of judgment, from the mercy seat. That's where he communicates with people. So as we go in and start looking at the centrality of Leviticus, as I said, Leviticus actually is considered for the Jewish tradition the most important book of all their books. So out of the Pentateuch, it's interesting, when they start to teach their catechumens, the first book that was taught was Leviticus, which is the book that we always put on the side. For them, no, this is the book you start with. And the centrality of Leviticus, it's not just that it's the book in the middle of the Pentateuch, but also there are a lot of events that are around Leviticus. So for example, the timeline between Genesis 12, which is Abraham, to Exodus 12, which is the Passover, is measured in years. The time from Numbers 10, which is like when they started moving from the Mount of Sinai to entering the Promised Land, was also years, 40 years. So this timeline is measured in years. However, saying that, from Exodus 12 to end of Leviticus, this is 1 year span, okay? And there is a span behind it of 1 year. So there's a 1 year span around Leviticus. This actually is the time of the liturgical year. So just like we have our liturgical year, so Leviticus was given to them in the time span where they spent it around Mount Sinai, okay, where they were given all these commandments. It spanned 1 year, which God was trying to tell them, if you're going to carry the tabernacle with you, you carry with you the liturgical year in the same thing. It's a perfect balance, because actually there are 6 notices, there are 6 ways how God was talking from prior to Sinai, and then from Sinai to Plains of Moab. Leviticus was right at the center. We talked about how Leviticus, there are 2 halves. This is a very interesting way, because in chapters 1 to 16, you're approaching God through blood, okay? And then chapter 16, which is the most important chapter, the chapter of the atonement, after that, you're approaching God through holiness, okay? Like the first 16 chapters is instructions how to offer these sacrifices. After chapter 16, it's actually how to approach God in a state of holiness. And I know this part is where we stumble a lot, because a lot of the conditions that are stated in chapters 17 to 27, okay, just like, menstruation, after having a sexual relationship with your wife, touching a dead body, having some blood, having some skin, discharges. All that stuff doesn't make sense to us, okay? So why would God put all these stipulations as one of the ways to approach holiness? We're going to talk about that. But just to understand Leviticus in structure, the first part is how to approach God through the holiness of through the blood of the sacrifice. The second half is about how our lives are supposed to be meant to think about God's holiness. Chapter 16, which is the most important ritual, we talked about it, is that this is the time when the whole community would come and offer once a year. This actually, Day of Atonement, is the day of not only purification of the people, is the purification of the sanctuary. Okay? Because during that day, there were certain things that would happen only on this one day, where the priest would be allowed to enter into the Holy of Holies and offer God's sacrifice in the Holy of Holies. So this was a very, very important ritual. So as we go into Leviticus, you start to realize that the first part of Leviticus, okay, just like you guys remember in Exodus, the Hebrew name for Exodus, do you guys remember what it was? Names, Shemot, the names. Remember, kind of like, actually we said that this was like the entrance to the book was about names, because it became about the names of the Israelites who were slaves in Egypt without a name in front of a king who's a tyrant that the Bible specifically omits the name of that tyrant, okay? The book of Leviticus, it's called, okay, in the Hebrew tradition, Vayikra. It's the first word in the book of Leviticus, which means, and he called to Moses. It's very interesting. Why is this the beginning? Why is this the first verse of Leviticus? And I'm going to come back to this, but the reason why, you guys remember last time when we ended last time's talk, we said that building the tabernacle and how glorious it was, and how God, at the end, his glory covered the tabernacle. Yet there was a problem, there was a challenge at the end of Exodus that didn't make any sense to us, which was the challenge that Moses, even though he was invited to go all the way up to the mountain and he saw God face to face, he was not allowed to enter the tent of meeting. You see in Exodus, the last verses in Exodus, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, but Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting. And this becomes a big dilemma, because how come God would tell Moses to build the tabernacle, yet not allow him to enter? And that's one of the reasons why, as you flip the page from Exodus and you go into Leviticus, the first word in Leviticus, and now God called to Moses. Because now this is the solution for this puzzle of why God did not allow Moses. And it becomes very, very interesting, because actually within the Jewish tradition, the tabernacle or the tent, okay, or the temple represents two things. And they're not the same. They're very closely tied together, but they're not the same. The first one is that the tent is God's dwelling, the divine dwelling, Mishkan, Meskan, okay? It's the divine dwelling. This is basically the height of the book of Exodus, where God said, my glory was on the Mount Sinai. Now build me a tabernacle so my glory can dwell inside this tabernacle. So it became a Mishkan, a divine dwelling. However, because God now dwells in it, it's not open for everyone to come in. Leviticus is the story of transformation of God's dwelling into the tent of meeting. Okay? So when actually one of the names of the tabernacle is called the tent of meeting. But you see how after God dwells, he has to then establish the method and the way how people can approach him to meet God and meet his glory without them dying from their unholiness. So the story of Leviticus is how Israel may meet God. And the reality is that this is very important, because when God decides to dwell in a place, his holiness covers this place. There is no overlap between the profane. The profane, by the way, sometimes we think of it as like something like really bad. No, it's common. It's unholy. It's not dedicated. When I say holy, sometimes we think of it as a moral judgment. When I say this is a holy man, so I'm giving them a moral judgment that this is a saint. But holy in its original sense means consecrated for the use of the Lord. It's not a moral judgment. It's a purpose. So when you say something is not holy, okay, or profane, doesn't mean you're making a moral judgment on it. You're just saying it is not dedicated at that time for the purpose of the Lord. So in order for God to bring them from the profane to the holiness, he had to bring to their mind what is the difference between life and death. Because when you are tied to the holy, you're tied to life. When you're distanced from the holy, you are destined to death. So in order for your mind, your neural circuits, that ritual, to make that connection, he had to give them rituals that make it clear in their mind what they're transitioning to. Let me give you a very, very simple example. Because here you have three categories, and those we're going to talk a little bit more about even next time further. There is the unclean, there is the clean, and then there is the sacred. Anything that is unclean cannot go to the sacred. It cannot. Anything that is clean can be dedicated for the sacred. Let me give you a very simple example, okay? And I'll give you this in an example from medicine because this will make you understand it. I have a butter knife and I have a scalpel. A butter knife, no matter what I do to it, will never be consecrated for a surgical procedure because it's a butter knife. So the fact that it can never be in a surgical procedure is not a moral judgment on it, okay? It's a judgment of purpose. But now I have the scalpel. The scalpel can be dedicated for a surgical procedure. But what does the scalpel need to go through in order to be dedicated only for the use of the surgery? It needs to be sterilized. So when I sterilize it, I have made it now into a consecrated, dedicated position for the surgery. It could happen that this scalpel, for reasons that are completely unrelated to a moral thing, it fell. Now it's unclean. I have to go through the ritual again of cleaning it and sterilizing it in order for it to become purposefully consecrated for the surgery. If I don't go through this ritual, what happens to my surgeries? If I don't go through this ritual, my surgeries will all be contaminated with bugs and bacteria, and infection would happen. If I don't respect this, I, as a person, okay, who's going through this process, can get harmed, and people around me can get harmed. As I was preparing this, the one image that came to my mind was 100%, this is what God meant, is when I had the opportunity to serve during the Ebola crisis in Liberia. And at that time, Liberia was going through its worst phase. And when I went for the first time to the hospital to volunteer, I literally had the head of the hospital standing on my head, teaching me how to scrub and how to put on the protective gear, something called donning, and how to take it off. The process to put it on and to take it off each time would take about 15 to 20 minutes. From the amount of meticulous, because you did not want to bring something in and nothing would come out. If you failed to follow these procedures, you are putting yourself in danger, but also everyone else around you in danger. And in fact, that was one of the biggest problems in other neighboring hospitals, is that the healthcare workers, because they were not well trained to follow the ritual, they got Ebola themselves and ended up dying, and they ended up spreading it. So having that ritual protected them and protected others. So by the same token, when you're looking at God, he's trying to tell them that there are certain things as you cross over from life to death, and that's something we're going to talk about next time, because when people stumble a little bit about this whole idea, what's about the sexual relationship? What's about the period? What's about the discharges? It was simply God's way of putting in their mind a remembrance, almost like a neural circuit, a neural network. Remember, every time you're crossing the threshold between life and death, you have to remember that God is the source of life. So during that period of time, you are not fit to come to the temple. It's not a moral judgment because you are unworthy. It is the judgment exactly as if like a scalpel fell on the ground, then you have to take it out, wash it, put it in sterilization. Anyone who's done sterilization in the old method knows that it takes 24 hours, right? So there's a period of time, and then after that you can consecrate it again to the Alwar. So anytime the human person came across a threshold between life and death, which, for example, in the sexual relationship, there is life that is being created, and there's also death that happens to other unborn children, okay? When you touch a dead body, all this is an indication that you've crossed that threshold. So when God was trying to bring into their mind this was very important. And that's one of the reasons why this sacred and profane was the reason why at the end God gave them the Levitical order. So in the opening of Leviticus, when God said he called unto them, he called unto Moses, this actually is bringing also a pattern through Scripture, because in Genesis 3, when God called to Adam, where are you? Where are you hiding? Same thing when God called to Moses from the burning bush, when God called to Moses from the mountain, when God called to Moses from the cloud, and then finally here, when God called to Moses from the tent of meeting. And here he was giving Moses and giving us the way to understand if we are going to approach God, we have to understand what does it mean of holiness, what does it mean to be a source of life, because that's where God dwells. We can see that in Leviticus, the ban on Moses entering was solved by the sacrifices. Because in Leviticus 9, it said, then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. The fire came out before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. This is exactly what happened when they saw God in the glory of the mountain. The same exact text. They saw the glory and they fell on their faces. So in the relationship, this is what was understanding, that the sacrificial cult is establishing a new relationship between God and Israel. That's what Israel had been waiting for. To understand the cult, okay, the cult which is like the ritual. Number one, the ritual is not the end of it itself. The ritual is, just like we talk about in the Arabic word, okay? You offer a korban. Korban, even within the Hebrew, the cognate is from to come near. Yuqarrib, qarabin. Yuqarrib, to draw near. So the idea of offering a korban, offering a sacrifice, entails in it everything about drawing near to God. So that's the journey of purification, transformation, and consecration in order that one can approach and come near to God through the korban. The question is that why the blood? And the blood, because God told them after the Day of Atonement, for the life of the flesh is in its blood, and I've given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. The blood signifies life. It's the basis of atonement. It's very interesting that actually in this verse, okay, Leviticus 17, it is completely the opposite of what we would assume, that we're offering the blood to a bloodthirsty God. No, it's the other way around. God is giving the blood as a gift to human beings. I'm giving you the blood. What does it mean I'm giving you the blood? I'm giving you the gift of life. So when you're sacrificing an animal, okay, you're basically indicating your acknowledgement for God that you know that He's the source of life. And when there is blood that has been sacrificed on the altar for your own sake, you are admitting to God that God, you are the source of life, you are the source of the blood that is in me, and the blood that has been spilled on the altar is a sign of that. So even when we take this now into the blood of Christ, every time we come and celebrate this, we're telling God, we acknowledge that it's only through the blood of your Son, Jesus Christ, we can be alive. It's only through that blood that we are alive. So the blood The first half is that blood signifies life. It's the base for atonement. The second half, as we talked about, which is what we're going to focus on next time, is the idea of that holiness. Once you have admitted that blood is the base of life, now you can live a holy life because you've realized what your life is worth. There will be no reason for you to live a holy life until you know what it is worth. As long as we never admit the worth of our life, there's no reason for us to live a holy life. But once we realize that our life is the cost of our life is blood, and the cost of this blood is the blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, now we start to realize that our call to holiness is because of what our life is worth. So that's where Leviticus is. You realize that in Leviticus, they don't start by calling to live a holy life. It's only after you realize the price that has been paid for your life, which is the price of blood, now you're invited to live a holy life. You see the connection? It's a very interesting connection. So now I want to spend the rest of the talk on understanding, so the different kinds of sacrifices. A lot of people get confused about them, but today we're actually going to study the general features that combine all these sacrifices. So even if you don't remember the exact details of each sacrifice, understanding the overall features will give us an understanding of what those sacrifices mean to us. In the sacrifices, there were 5 sacrifices, and it's a beautiful sacrifice, and that will be our talk next week. But then there is the ascension sacrifice, where the full consecration, the whole animal is burned, and this one is actually called in Hebrew, ola. Okay, it's the ola. It's the one going up. And then there is the tribute, which is the gift of grain. And then there is the peace, or the fellowship, which is called the shilamim, the peace offering. And then there are 2 offerings made for specific sins or guilt, which is called the purification and the reparation offering. Those will focus a little bit more about the details of them and what the specifics of them next time. But for now, let's talk about what all these have in common. Because in them we achieve purification, consecration, and communion. There are 6 rites of the sacrifice. And this applies to all of them. There are 6 rites. We'll go through them one by one. The first rite is the rite of the presentation, where you are presenting something to God, whether it is a lamb, whether it is a dove, whether it is grain, whether it is oil. There is an art and there is a command for that presentation. So an Israelite is supposed to present an unblemished animal from their own flock, underscoring their personal cost and the substitution that happened. When they failed to do that, that was one of God's criticisms for them in Malachi. When you offer blind animals for sacrifice, is that not evil? When you offer the lame and the sick, is that not evil? So the presentation, the animal is without blemish, is whole and sound, symbolizing their moral wholeness. Even though I may not be whole, but I am offering a lamb as a whole animal in order for me to recognize my shortcoming, but realizing that maybe through this sacrifice, I will be transformed into what the lamb represents. Let me say this again. So even if I'm not blameless and I'm not whole, my choice of a blameless and a whole lamb is my invocation of God through the sacrifice to give me the power to become just like this lamb. And it's interesting when you look at the word that the animal was given, this without blemish, tamim. This was the same word that was given to Noah and Abraham, okay, when they were asked and called by God to walk before God. That's what Abraham was called, to. Be blameless, be whole, be tamim, and walk before me. So in this case, the choice, so that presentation was the first step that applied to the grains, applied to the oil, which is basically trying to tell God that my life is not wholesome, but I am praying through this sacrifice to offer you the best that I have. You guys remember when we talked about the Passover lamb? The Passover lamb was not a punishment. It was basically the presentation of the choice lamb from the firstborn, which is Israel, to God as an act of devotion and worship. And you remember we talked about it. If you don't devote your best, you will die. Because if you're selfish and you're keeping it for yourself, you're not giving it to God. It will not last. So the first rite is the rite of presentation. The second rite is called the hand leaning. Then he shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. This would happen for the burnt sacrifice, would happen for the peace, would happen for the guilt, would happen for the reparation. They would lean. It's not just you're putting your hand. Almost like sometimes they would say you're actually leaning on it. You're putting your weight on it. There have been a lot of different ideas. What does this do when you are leaning and laying your hand on the sacrifice? Some people thought that it was a sin transfer, but actually that's not the right way, because technically that lamb is a whole and an unblemished lamb and is accepted by God as whole and unblemished. So you're not transferring your sin to the lamb, okay? There is some, like in the Day of the Atonement, because in the Day of Atonement, they release a goat and they keep one. One of those released, they take away the sin of the people. In that case, the sin is transferred to that goat. But when you're putting your hand on the lamb, the sin doesn't transfer to the lamb. But what happens in this is that you're identifying, when you're leaning on it, you're identifying yourself, saying that I am identifying with this lamb. And when this lamb's blood is going to be slain on the altar, it is my admission that my blood, okay, is dedicated to God. I'm identifying with this lamb. So then when this lamb is burned as an offering, as a sacrifice, and it goes up to heaven, I am ascending. That's what they call the vicarious ascent. I am ascending to heaven with it. So there is, in a sense, there is an identification. It's not a transfer. It's an identification that I am putting myself into this, which we've taken actually also in the New Testament, because in the New Testament, we always talk about hiding ourselves through the sacrifice of God. The sacrifice of Christ covers us, and we're hid inside it. Actually, Saint Cyril the Great always talks about this, how we have been hid in the humanity of Christ in every step that he's done. So that is the identification, or like laying the hand. The third rite is the slaughter. The Israelite himself ritually slaughters the animal, demonstrating willingness to die for oneself. You got to imagine that at times it was hard, because you've had this animal with you for a long period, for like a year at least. You've grown fond of it. You're choosing the choicest animal, and you're the one who has to slaughter it. That ritual, when you're doing it, brings inside you, if you're truly moved to God at that point, an understanding of how this sacrifice is a gift you're giving to God from what he's given you already. Because he's the one who's given you those lambs. He's the one who's given you the flock. He's the one who's given you the life. He's the one who's given you your blood. So this blood is your gift. God has given it to you. When you are sacrificing the blood, you're acknowledging God's gift to you. The fourth rite, the blood manipulation. So in this case, the priest, okay, takes part of the blood, and sometimes they sprinkle it on the altar of the ascension. Sometimes they sprinkle it on the ark once a year, the Day of Atonement. It's sprinkled on the ark. They actually sprinkle the blood in the Holy of Holies. At some point when the priesthood was actually consecrated, Moses took the blood and consecrated Aaron and his sons. So there is a rite where basically that the blood is applied to everywhere, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I've given it to you upon the altar to make atonement. Yes, it is a ransom, but it's also a purification. And as I said, the blood was basically applied at times in the outer altar, in the outer sanctum, on the blood on the incense altar, and sometimes in the inner sanctum in the Holy of Holies. Once a year, it would be done inside the Holy of Holies. So you've taken, you've slaughtered the animal, then you gather the blood and you sprinkle it as a sign that now you, as people, as well as the place, has been purified. And as I said, the blood is not a gift that we give to God as if he's a bloodthirsty deity, but it's God's gift to us, that we acknowledge that life given by him is a gift. The fifth rite is the burning. And the burning, actually, the way that they talk about it is a specific term called hiktir, which is very different than other term they use for burning. There's another term for burning, which actually is a derivative of the word seraph, from which we get seraphim, the burning ones. Okay, hiktir is basically a specific word said for burning, where something is burned for it to go up as smoke, as a pleasing aroma to God in his heaven. The ascension offering, which is something we're going to talk about next time, it was an offering that was the most pleasing to God because it was an offering that was intended for humanity to offer something consecrated that would keep rising in perpetuity to God. And God took it as a very, very pleasing aroma. It was what they called almost the ground of all sacrifices. So if you are offering a sacrifice for the sin, you have to offer it on top of a sacrifice of the ascension. You find this in Noah, you find this in Abraham, you find this in David. And within this ascension offering, this whole idea of the consecration going up, there are several aspects of it. First one is consecration. Ola means the one that rises towards God. Okay, Abraham is dramatizing his devotion. Okay, even the presentation of Isaac was considered to be an ascension offering. It was an offering pleasing to God. The first aspect is consecrating. The second aspect is when the sacrifice is transformed into the same nature of God, which is fire and smoke. You see how beautiful this is? So within the sacrifice, we, through identification with the Lamb, are transformed into the likeness of God. That's where it becomes like, partakers of the divine nature. So part of the ascension, when the Lamb is on fire and becomes fire and smoke, and all of it ascends as a pleasing aroma to God, it's through our identification with this that we become one with it. And in fact, this ascension is what we see in the story of the father and mother of Samson. Okay? At that time, when the angel of the Lord appeared to them and told them, you're going to have Samson, okay? And they offered at that point an offering, an ascension offering. And it says in the text that as the flame ascended heavenwards from the altar, the messenger of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar. Through the hiktir rite, which is the flame, the Israelite ascends into Yahweh, ushered with the clouds. Like we are transformed, and then we're also ascending to God through this sacrifice. So this theology, it becomes the question, okay, well, who will ascend to the mountain of the Lord? That's what we talked about it. The one who will ascend to the mountain of the Lord is the one who has chosen a blameless lamb, consecrated it to God, put it on the altar, agreed that it would be transformed into the likeness of God through fire and through smoke. And it slowly ascends from the altar to God's heaven. That's the person who could ascend into the mountain. That's the imagery we're seeing. And then the last rite, which is the communion, the peace offering. So not all the sacrifices the Israelites were allowed to eat from it. Okay? So the ascension offering, the first one, it would be burnt totally to God, because this was the gift of like rising up to God. The grain offering, some of it they were allowed to eat, and then the peace offering. The peace offering was the main one that people would come together, including the people who offered it, as well as the poor of the people. They would come and all have fellowship together and eat of it together. So this is actually now where God says that as they presented, God gave them to eat. They're amply sated by the abundance of your house. You give them drink from the river of your pleasures. Blessed is the man you choose and cause to approach you, that he may dwell in your courts. In fact, this word pleasure, the river of your pleasures, this is bringing back the Garden of Eden, because Eden means pleasure. So when you are eating of that, you'll be able to feast from it. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice in all what you have put, and rejoice in all to which you have put your hand, you and your households, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. So that's where we bring actually this whole idea that God gave them. You remember when I talked about Leviticus spanned a whole year? God was giving them the ritual throughout the year, throughout the seasons, throughout every day, because there was the table, and in that table of sacrifice, they were given this whole idea of the atonement. It starts with the Day of Atonement, the intercession, and then every day, morning and evening, they would offer a sacrifice of ascension where they would meet God at the tent of meeting. But at the end of every sacrifice, they were given the blessing. So the daily ascension, the priest emerges from the holy place, fragrant with incense, lay the lamb upon the altar, tribute of flour and oil, and drink offering of wine. And the pillar of smoke would ascend to God heavenly every day. After the priest is done with this, he will give them the benediction. When you come to God with your sacrifice, you leave with a blessing. Let me say this again. When you come to God with a sacrifice, you leave with a blessing. Because when you come to Him with a sacrifice, He cleanses you, He consecrates you, and then He blesses you. Every day when people would come to the altar, at the end of the service, Aaron would come out and tell them, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And the Lord lift up His countenance, His face upon you, and give you peace." Every time. That was called the priestly benediction. And that's one of the reasons why the 12 loaves, were called the 12 loaves of the face. Because that's basically that when this was the face of Israel, and the light, the menorah, would be shining on it all the time. That's why it was called the showbread, or the bread of the face. So here at the end, Aaron or the priest will come and tell them, "May the Lord shine His face upon you." That is how you get the blessing. And this was God's perpetual command, because in every place where I record my name, I will come to you and I will bless you. Because the triad of the altar, the divine name and the blessing, became the way that people can live their lives. Just like as we come to the liturgy, once a week or twice a week, we are given a blessing. Abuna comes at the end and gives us the benediction. And then he asks God, dwell with them, walk among them. And then whoever wants to go in peace, go in peace. You see how we've carried the same exact benediction. So, to summarize, the tent of meeting is fulfilled because God promised Moses, "There I will meet in the tent of meeting with the children of Israel, and the tabernacle shall be sanctified by my glory." So there Yahweh meets Israel daily at the altar. The Mishkan has become an Ohel Moed. So the dwelling place has become a tent of meeting. So to summarize, how did this transformation happen? How did the dwelling of God become the tent of meeting? One word: the altar. The altar. Because through that altar, the gift of sacrifice was given as a way to approach God's holiness. I think of the altar, it's exactly like the scrub place that I have to go to in order for me to be consecrated to go into surgery. So in order for us to transform our lives as we bring it, to bring it into close to the holiness of God, the only path for us to bring our lives into the holiness of God is through the altar. And that altar is not something that we're gifting to God, it's God's gift to us. The blood is given to us as a gift where we recognize our need for God, how much our lives are dependent on God. When we choose the lamb and offer the lamb, it's our admission that we're identifying ourselves with something that is of the best choice. Because when you're offering your best, you're identifying that God is worth the best of you. When you're offering the best, you are identifying that your life is worth the best. And when your life becomes worth the best, which is holy, you are going to live a fulfilled life. But only when you realize what it's worth. That's why the book of Leviticus, in the beginning, it's all about the blood, the importance of blood. And then at the end is how to live a holy life. And as we're going to talk about next time, as to live a holy life is to basically live a life that appreciates life. That appreciates life. So it's not about being clean and unclean. It's not about male and female. It's not about a lot of the conditions we think of as if God is picking on people. No. God was giving people almost like a new neurological manual of trigger that comes into your mind of remembering that God is the source of life. Say again? In our modern day? Yes. So in our modern day, there's definitely a lot of challenges of how we have inherited that. There's no doubt about it. But also, I would say that a lot of the people who are well-read within this have a much, much, much more different opinion about it. Okay? Because they realize that this was God's way of bringing to the attention of the people the crossing over between life and death that we go through every day of our lives, that we go through many cycles in the month, as we go through many cycles in our life itself. And at the end of the day, the call was not a moral, rather a ceremonial. Just exactly as I say, the difference between a butter knife and a scalpel, okay? It's what is suited for this, okay? And am I in a condition now that I've been purified to approach the holiness? If I'm not today, it doesn't mean that tomorrow I cannot be. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so that was not necessarily a punishment as much as a recognition. Clearly, the struggle is how we take this in the 21st century. Because now, honestly, our understanding of life and death is very different from the Israelites. However, saying that, the same call for us to honor life is the same call. I think our fight is different. Our fight could be in the whole idea of abortion, for example. Okay, that's one of the ways we uphold the sanctity of life. So if I look at Leviticus, it was basically God's way to uphold the sanctity of life, to keep reminding them of the sanctity of life. Okay, so to your point, definitely we have a lot of struggles of how we interpret these nowadays. Okay, but to summarize, the way that the dwelling place becomes the tent of meeting is only through the altar. And on the altar, it's only through going through those 6 rites. The rite of presentation, the rite of laying the hand, the rite of slaughtering, the rite of splashing the blood, the rite of ascension, and then lastly, the rite of the benediction with the blessing. When you go through all these sacrifices, at the end of the day, what is the result? Your life is blessed. Your life is blessed by what you have offered to God on the altar. So that's how we look at Leviticus and how we look at our modern day. Leviticus was nothing but God putting in their minds and in their lives the necessary ritual to understand the holiness of God. All right? So next time we're going to end Leviticus. We're going to talk a little bit about the specific, like a little bit of a note on each of those 5 sacrifices, specific word about it. And then we're going to come into the holiness code and discuss it. And then the last session, I'm going to do a special session where we're going to take Exodus and Leviticus and transpose it to the story of the Transfiguration in the New Testament, where I'm going to show you how the whole story of the Transfiguration is not completely, but almost all of it is based on Leviticus and Exodus. Okay? And you'll see that parallel in a very beautiful way. Okay? Questions?
Was it necessary to go through this bloody process? You know, I know that the Israelites at that time, they were in war and killing, and blood was to them like wood.
Yes.
And nowadays, in our lives, blood is something disgusting.
Yeah.
Was there the only way that God can bring them to understand and accept through blood? Because this is subscorners, they call Leviticus is the bloodless.
Yes. Yes. It's a great question, Ash. Was there another way? Well, I think we can speculate about what God would do. However, saying that, I think that God had to teach them sanctity through something that is a bit dramatic. Within our lives, there is nothing more dramatic than the sight of blood. To your point, because they were surrounded by blood for many different reasons through the war, their only interpretation of blood at that point could be in a point of revenge and a point of power. Because I can shed your blood, I'm showing my power over you. In order for God to redeem again that sanctity of life away from the war, He calls them back where basically the blood can be a sign of a gift when it's given in this condition of a blameless, choice lamb, one that you have grown yourself, one that is now you're almost taking part of your heart. And when you sacrifice it for God, your identification is that my blood and the blood of my family is represented in this lamb as dedicated for God. Instead of being sacrilegious, that it be easy for us to, kill each other because blood is cheap. So, in fact, I would tell you that actually God redeeming the idea of the blood as a sign of sanctity of life was very important. Otherwise, it would have been so cheap to shed for every reason. That's one of the reasons why, for example, in the early chapters of Genesis, when God says, okay, whoever sheds blood will have his blood shed, because in the image of God, man was created. So God was trying to tell them, is like, you guys can't just go and kill each other willy-nilly and for the sake of nothing. So I believe that actually doing this, God was regaining again the idea of sanctity of shedding blood. Because also when you're shedding that blood, you're shedding it for yourself. So now you start to understand, if I'm going to honor my own blood, I'm going to have to honor the blood of the other person as well. So I think that's one answer. I think a second answer is that sacrifice was very, very common amongst all the cultures. The question, it was done, why was it done? For most of the other religious cultures, it was done because it was thought to appease a bloodthirsty deity. Here, what is unique about Leviticus that he keeps repeating, I am giving you the blood as a gift. You are not giving me the blood as a gift. Okay? The blood as a gift is basically God telling them, the fact that I'm giving you life, that your blood is not shed, okay, that's a gift I'm giving you. When you are offering this sacrifice, you're acknowledging what's implicit in it, that God has saved your life. Okay? So there is a sense of symbolism in it, okay, of understanding what is the gift in there. And that's one of the reasons why he had all the laws about, like, you know, when you're in this condition, don't approach God, because basically it was all about admitting the sanctity of life itself. So, to your point, was it effective? Well, the author of Hebrews says no. We know that, like you know, because the blood of rams and bulls couldn't cleanse. Okay, and then he talks about the blood of Jesus Christ. It was the language. It was the ritual. Okay, it was the ritual, and that ritual is very, very powerful, and that's something I find fascinating, which is, like, you can talk about the neurological changes that happen with a ritual, and how a ritual saves. And to me, going into the story of, like, the Ebola, the ritual saved. Okay, and to me, as I look at it right now, the ritual that we do when it's done in full understanding has a salvific power. Because I live in an embodied sense of what I am being ritualizing. Great question. Yes? We'll talk about it next time. Yeah. We'll talk about the strange fire. Yeah. So the question is about Aaron's son Nadab and Abihu, and why did God kill them? So that will be next time. We'll talk about it next time. Very true. Very true. So there's no doubt, and I'll just very simply, okay, why the difference? And scholars have debated a lot. What was the mistake of Nadab and Abihu? And the difference was, at the time of the golden calf, the law was not yet given. The instructions were not yet given clearly. Whether or not that gives Aaron an excuse or not, that is debatable. But there weren't clear yet instructions at that time. In Nadab and Abihu, there were already clear instructions on how to approach God. Scholars believe that their biggest mistake was two things. Number one, they tried to approach the Holy of Holies, while it was only for the high priest and only once a year. So they were transgressing. Because here's the thing, you can go and worship a false god and God is going to let you to your own ignorance. But to come and transgress in God's own holy place, you are almost like, you know what, you're committing that sin directly against God. There's some other scholars that believe that they even approached God at that point in that condition while they were drunk. Okay? So because of that, this was like, God is like, no, you can't approach the Holy of Holies while you're drunk without God inviting you. So that's a little bit different than the golden calf, because the golden calf was a sin of ignorance, not a sin of prideful transgression against God and against his holy place. Okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about it next time, but this is kind of simply the difference between those two occasions, even though there was transgression. But also, for Aaron, he was commanded by God not to mourn Nadab and Abihu. He was not allowed to. Because basically, and this is really harsh, because he was approaching God the next day, and God basically, that was the Day of Atonement, He said, do not show any signs of mourning. Because you know, when you mourn, you had to wear certain clothes of mourning. And when he was approaching God, you're not going to approach God with the clothes of death. You're going to approach him with the white tunic, which is the Day of Atonement. So he was punished. Aaron was also punished, but in a different sense. Yes, Eric. Yes? That's the point of trust. Yes, yes. So when God is giving the order for the sacrifices, you know, there is a sense of trust that we trust Him at the end. But needless to say, a lot of people do have a hard time with Leviticus. But the way that I look at it is in the context of what we talked about last time, is being placed in the big context of the whole story of salvation, Eden to New Jerusalem. And then this time, in the story of the ritual, what does the ritual indicate? When you look at those sacrifices from those two perspectives, they start to make not a bit of sense, but an understanding of the big picture. Okay? Between Eden to New Jerusalem, but also in the rituals themselves you're doing in these sacrifices. So the harshness can then start to make some sense for you. Okay? Great questions. So next time we'll close and talk a little bit about the individual sacrifices, about the holiness code, and then we'll also chat a little bit about Nadab and Abihu. Thank you all. I know it's a little bit of the heavier stuff, but thank you for bearing with me, you know, just so we all can try to study it together.